The street was quiet that evening, the kind of calm that makes every sudden sound feel louder than it should. A few pedestrians walked past, glancing at their phones, unaware of the tension that was about to erupt just a block away. A young girl stood on the sidewalk, her posture confident, her eyes steady. She wasn't loud, she wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet strength about her, the kind that makes people notice, whether they mean to or not. Then came the officer, his uniform crisp, his expression rigid, and his tone sharp. He approached with authority, but authority born more of prejudice than reason. "Step aside," he barked. "Move along." The girl shook her head slightly. She didn't speak, she didn't resist. She simply refused to comply with an unfair demand. To her, it was a matter of principle, but to the officer, it was a challenge to his power. His eyes narrowed, his grip tightened. The quiet street suddenly felt charged, every passerby pausing, sensing that something was off. The officer's impatience grew, his assumption clear. He believed he knew exactly how the situation would unfold. Then, in a moment of reckless haste, he lunged. The girl tried to pull away, but his hands were strong, too strong. A sudden snap, a sharp gasp, her arm was broken. The scream that followed pierced the calm evening, echoing down the street. People nearby froze. Phones appeared, capturing the shocking moment. Whispers ran through the small crowd that had gathered. Did he just? Why would he? Call someone. But the officer, blinded by his assumptions, didn't notice the reactions. To him, the situation was under control. He thought he had asserted his power. He thought he had done what needed to be done. What he didn't realize, what no one on the street yet knew, was that this was far from an ordinary situation. The girl he had just hurt was not just anyone. She carried a legacy, a quiet strength that commanded respect in ways the officer could never have imagined. And in just moments, the world around him, the bystanders, the street, the entire scene, would shift. A presence would arrive that would expose arrogance, demand accountability, and leave the officer stunned. The air seemed to hold its breath. Something was coming, and in that instant everyone knew. Nothing would ever be the same for this officer, this girl, or the street that bore witness to the shocking event. The street was still buzzing with murmurs and disbelief after the shocking incident. People who had just witnessed the officer break the girl's arm were frozen, unsure whether to intervene, call for help, or simply watch. The sound of sirens could be faintly heard in the distance, but the tension in the air made every second stretch like an eternity. The girl stood, or rather limped slightly, her face set with a mix of pain and quiet defiance. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, refusing to let fear or intimidation take hold. Her hand instinctively went to her arm, which throbbed with sharp, agonizing pain, but she held herself with composure that was both surprising and unnerving. The officer, on the other hand, was growing more agitated by the second. His eyes darted around, scanning the small crowd of bystanders. Some were filming on their phones, some were whispering nervously, and a few brave souls were stepping closer, their hands raised as if trying to signal caution or protest. But he ignored them. Authority, he believed, was power, and in his mind, the situation was simple. "You'll cooperate." The officer barked again, his tone sharper now. The words had lost their original authority, replaced by frustration and impatience. "Step aside. Now." The girl's gaze didn't waver. She met his eyes evenly, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. It was clear she understood the stakes. She knew the officer assumed he had full control, that his bias and arrogance gave him the upper hand. But appearances, as it often does, can be deceiving. A few bystanders exchanged glances, whispering nervously, "Do you see how calm she is? She's not afraid, that's unusual. Why isn't he backing down?" The officer moved closer, his grip tightening around her arm again, this time less reckless, but more deliberate. His assumptions had clouded his judgment completely. To him, she was just another girl challenging his authority. Someone small, someone weaker, someone who could be subdued with force. What he didn't know, and what no one watching realized yet, was that she wasn't just any girl. The way she held herself, the quiet confidence in her eyes, hinted at something more, something deeper. something that would soon change the power dynamic entirely. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the crowd, calm, composed, and commanding attention without a single word. The murmurs of the crowd shifted to gasps. They recognized him instantly. He didn't need to shout or demand respect. The very air seemed to bend around him, drawing focus naturally. "Do you know who she is?" the man asked, his voice measured but carrying unmistakable authority. The officer looked at him dismissively at first. "Just another kid," he sneered, shaking his head. He had no idea that the presence he faced would soon dismantle his arrogance entirely. The young girl didn't move. She simply glanced at the man with a subtle nod of acknowledgement. She trusted him, and in that instant, the tension on the street shifted. The officers still believed he had power, still thought he controlled the situation. But the arrival of this figure, a quiet yet commanding presence, meant that assumptions were about to be shattered, and that the consequences of his actions would be far greater than he could have imagined. Every bystander now felt it, the calm before the storm, the moment when arrogance meets the reality it cannot control. The girl's strength, combined with the arrival of someone who carried the weight of both respect and authority, meant that the scene was no longer just an incident on the street. It was a moment that would leave everyone present forever changed. The officer's grip tightened again, this time with deliberate force. The girl winced but didn't cry out. Her jaw set, eyes blazing with quiet defiance. Onlookers froze, some stepping back, some holding up their phones, capturing the shocking scene. The street, once calm, now felt like the eye of a storm, tension so thick it seemed to press against everyone's chest. "Move!" the officer barked, his voice cracking slightly with frustration. "You don't get to challenge me." The girl shook her head, her silence louder than any scream. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. Her body language alone made it clear she wouldn't submit to injustice so easily. And that made the officer angrier. His face reddened, his jaw tight. He assumed he had absolute control. He assumed that his uniform, his authority, and his prejudice were enough to bend her will. He didn't see the truth in her eyes, that she wasn't just any girl. The quiet confidence, the calm strength she carried, hinted at a power the officer couldn't comprehend. But he pressed forward anyway, blinded by arrogance and bias. A sudden movement, perhaps a reflexive shift in her weight, caused the officer to overreach. Pain shot through her arm, a sharp, acute reminder of the reckless force being used. She cried out this time, the scream echoing down the street and drawing more onlookers closer. The crowd gasped, some horrified, some frozen in disbelief. A few whispered urgently, "Call someone, this isn't right." But the officer didn't hear them. He was lost in his assumptions, convinced he was enforcing order. To him, the girl's pain was irrelevant. Her defiance was an affront to his authority. His eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body tense, as he tried to maintain control over a situation that was quickly spiraling beyond him. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the edge of the crowd, calm, composed, yet unmistakably commanding. The murmurs of the spectators shifted to whispers of recognition. Phones pivoted to capture this person, and a ripple of awe moved through the bystanders. The officer sneered dismissively. "Who cares who she is? She's just a kid," he said, his voice tight with frustration. But even as he spoke, a subtle change rippled through the air. The street seemed heavier, the atmosphere charged. This presence, quiet yet powerful, shifted the dynamics instantly. "Do you know who she is?" the man asked calmly, his voice measured, almost serene, but carrying unmistakable weight. The officer's confident smirk faltered. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but he masked it with a scoff. "I said she's just a kid," he repeated, louder this time, trying to reclaim control. The crowd leaned in. Some stepped closer. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching like hours. They could feel the balance of power beginning to shift. The officer's assumptions, his arrogance, and his prejudice were about to collide with a reality he hadn't anticipated, one that would expose his recklessness and force accountability. The girl glanced at the approaching man, a subtle nod passing between them. She trusted him. She knew what was coming. And in that moment, the officer realized, too late, that he was no longer in control. The situation had escalated beyond his authority, beyond his assumptions, and now, The consequences of his actions were about to be revealed in the most unexpected way imaginable. The street was electric with tension. Bystanders had frozen mid-step, their phones raised, capturing every moment. The young girl stood there, her arm throbbing from the officer's reckless grip, yet her gaze remained steady, unwavering. There was a quiet defiance in her posture, a calm courage that seemed to radiate from her despite the sharp pain she was trying to hide. The officer, still tight-lipped and rigid, felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something he couldn't quite place. The murmurs from the crowd had grown louder, and whispers of speculation spread like wildfire. People were pointing, phones recording, but more than that, the way they were looking at him, the way their eyes flicked between the girl and the figure now stepping closer, began to gnaw at his confidence. From the edge of the crowd emerged a man, calm, composed, and exuding authority without a single raised voice. He walked with measured steps, his presence commanding attention as if the street itself had bent around him. The crowd instinctively parted, giving him space, their collective awareness drawn to this figure whose quiet aura was somehow more powerful than the officer's uniformed authority. The officer straightened, chest puffed, and tried to mask the unease rising in his chest. "Who is he?" he muttered under his breath, though no one dared answer. His assumptions, his arrogance, had guided his actions up to this point. But suddenly, the air around him felt heavier, charged with an undeniable weight. The man approached slowly, keeping his gaze on the girl. "Do you know who she is?" he asked calmly. There was no threat in his tone, only a quiet authority that demanded attention. The officer scoffed dismissively. "She's just a kid," he said, his voice louder, sharp with irritation. "Nothing special. Move along." The crowd held its breath. Every person on the street sensed the tension, the subtle but unmistakable shift. The girl's strength, her defiance, now seemed amplified by the presence of this man. She glanced at him briefly, a small nod of acknowledgement passing between them, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Then came the realization. The crowd began to whisper frantically. "Wait, is that? No, it can't be." The officer's confident smirk faltered as he finally caught sight of the man's face. Recognition, immediate and profound, flashed across his features, quickly replaced by disbelief and fear. I don't understand," the officer stammered, his earlier arrogance collapsing. He had believed he was in full control, that his authority was absolute, that this situation was simple. But the quiet calm of the approaching man, the subtle nod from the girl, and the gasps of the onlookers told him otherwise. "Yes," the man said, his voice calm, almost serene. "I am her father." The street went silent. Even the ambient noises, the distant traffic, the murmuring crowd, the rustle of wind through nearby trees, seemed to vanish, leaving only the weight of the moment. The officer froze, a mixture of shock, fear, and humiliation washing over him. The confident smirk that had guided his actions moments ago was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling expression. Keanu Reeves. The name whispered through the crowd like a shockwave. Recognition spread instantly. Some fans caught sight, some onlookers realized the significance, and those who didn't know the name could feel the authority, respect, and undeniable presence radiating from him. The young girl, now supported subtly by the quiet calm of her father's presence, lifted her gaze to meet the officer's. There was no anger in her eyes, only a steady reminder that assumptions and prejudice carry consequences far beyond what one imagines. The officer's hands, which had gripped her arm moments before, now hung limply at his sides. Every muscle tensed as he realized he had misjudged the situation entirely. The girl he had believed was just another kid was connected to someone whose influence, presence, and authority could no longer be ignored. The crowd erupted into whispers, gasps, and murmurs of awe. Phones were pointed, capturing the moment that would instantly become viral. The officer, once confident and rigid, now understood fully. He had made a grave mistake. His assumptions, his prejudice, and his recklessness had collided with a reality far larger than he could have anticipated. And in that instant, everyone on the street, witnesses, bystanders, and even the officer himself, knew that this was a turning point, a lesson in humility, authority, and the quiet but undeniable power of presence had just unfolded. The street held its breath, waiting for what would come next. And with the calm, commanding presence of Keanu Reeves, it was clear. Nothing would ever be the same for the officer, the girl, or anyone who had witnessed this moment of truth. The crowd's whispers had grown into a low hum of anticipation. Phones hovered in midair, capturing every moment, every expression. The officer, once filled with arrogance and blind confidence, now stood frozen, his face pale, sweat forming along his hairline. He had assumed control, assumed power, assumed he knew everything. But now, he faced a reality he could not ignore. Keanu Reeves took a step closer to his daughter. Calm, composed, and impossibly commanding, his presence alone seemed to bend the energy of the street. People instinctively parted to give him space, a subtle acknowledgement that this was no ordinary man, and no ordinary situation. Every eye in the crowd followed him. Every camera lens turned. "Do you realize what you've done?" Keanu's voice was steady, quiet, but it carried a weight that made even the officer flinch. It wasn't anger or rage. It was authority, the kind that doesn't need shouting to demand attention. "This is my daughter, and you have caused her harm without reason." The officer swallowed hard. Words failed him. His arrogance, the foundation on which he had justified his actions, crumbled before the calm, undeniable presence of Keanu Reeves. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no sound that could reclaim the authority he had so carelessly wielded. The girl stepped slightly closer to her father, still wincing from her broken arm, but now visibly supported, empowered by the quiet strength standing beside her. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only trust, pride, and a subtle defiance that made the officer's attempt to assert control look small and meaningless. Keanu looked directly at the officer, his gaze unwavering. "You assumed power because you believed appearances gave you authority. But authority without respect is meaningless. Your actions have consequences, and today, those consequences are immediate." At that moment, a few bystanders quietly called for emergency assistance, and others stepped closer, sensing the tension finally shifting. The officer's body language betrayed him completely. Shoulders slumped, hands trembling, eyes darting nervously. Every instinct he had relied on to dominate the situation now failed him. The crowd began to murmur, a mix of awe and disbelief. "It's Keanu Reeves. He's calm, but he's commanding respect." The officer doesn't know what hit him. The whispers spread like wildfire, and even those unfamiliar with the actor could sense the weight of his presence. Keanu extended a hand, not toward the officer, but toward his daughter, gently guiding her aside and checking her condition. "We will ensure you are safe," he said softly to her, every word filled with calm reassurance. She nodded, a small smile breaking through the pain. Then he turned fully toward the officer. The crowd held its breath. Keanu didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. His calm, controlled presence conveyed every message: accountability, authority, and justice. The officer's actions were exposed not just to the girl and her father, but to everyone watching. The entire street had become a stage for the lesson he had failed to see. "You will answer for what you've done," Keanu continued. "Prejudice has no place in justice. Harm inflicted without cause will not be ignored. And remember this: respect is earned through fairness and understanding, not fear or assumptions." The officer nodded weakly, realizing fully that his authority had been dismantled. His previous power, the uniform, the badge, the sense of control, was meaningless in the face of truth, justice, and presence. Every step he had taken to assert dominance was revealed as a mistake, and the lesson was as public as it was undeniable. The crowd's murmurs turned into a low applause, subtle but respectful. People weren't cheering for confrontation or conflict. They were recognizing accountability, fairness, and the power of calm authority over arrogance. Keanu guided his daughter down the street, her broken arm supported, her head held high. The officer remained where he was, reflecting on what had just occurred. This encounter, captured in real time, would leave a mark far beyond the street. Videos would go viral, discussions would ignite, and the lesson would be clear. Assumptions, bias, and misuse of power always carry consequences. And in that moment, the quiet yet commanding presence of Keanu Reeves had transformed what could have been a simple act of violence into a powerful reminder. Justice and respect are not demanded, They are embodied. The officer's smirk was gone. Confidence had been replaced with reflection. The girl's pain remained, but it was now paired with the reassurance that she was protected, seen, and valued. And the crowd, witness to the revelation, would never forget the lesson. Presence, calm, and integrity are stronger than any act of arrogance or prejudice. The street had finally begun to settle, but the tension lingered like an electric charge in the air. The bystanders who had gathered watched silently, still in awe of the encounter that had unfolded before them. Phones continued to record, capturing the moment that would soon ripple across social media, spreading far beyond the block where it had happened. The officer, once confident and aggressive, now stood frozen in the middle of the street. His body language had completely shifted, shoulders slumped, hands trembling slightly, eyes darting nervously to avoid the gaze of the people around him. Every ounce of authority he had relied upon moments ago had crumbled under the weight of the truth. He had acted recklessly, blinded by prejudice, and had underestimated the situation entirely. Keanu Reeves guided his daughter gently to the sidewalk, ensuring she was steady and supported. She winced at every step, her arms still throbbing from the broken bones, but her expression reflected a sense of safety now that her father was there. Calm authority radiated from him, a quiet power that reassured everyone watching. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, yet the officer understood fully the consequences of his actions. A few bystanders, emboldened by the presence of Keanu Reeves, approached cautiously. "Do you need help?" one asked softly. "Is she okay?" Keanu nodded, acknowledging the concern while keeping his attention on his daughter and the officer. His calmness contrasted sharply with the chaos that had erupted moments before, demonstrating that true authority is exercised through control and presence, not aggression. The officer finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. I didn't know." His words were weak, lacking conviction. He had realized too late that ignorance does not excuse harm, and that prejudice and assumptions carry consequences far beyond personal perception. Keanu's steady gaze met his, and in that silence, a lesson was conveyed. Accountability and integrity matter more than authority or intimidation. Medical personnel arrived shortly after, guided by the onlookers. They carefully examined the girl's arm, stabilizing it with precision and professionalism. She remained calm, her composure bolstered by her father's presence. The officer, meanwhile, was gently ushered aside by bystanders, who ensured he would be properly held accountable for his reckless actions. As the crowd dispersed slightly, the street buzzed with conversation. "Did you see that?" one bystander whispered. Keanu Reeves didn't yell or threaten, but the officer, he couldn't handle it. Another added, "It's amazing how calm he is. True power doesn't need to be loud." Keanu knelt briefly beside his daughter, checking her carefully. "You were strong," he said softly. "You handled yourself well. But remember, safety comes first. Courage is never about recklessness." She nodded, a small smile breaking through the pain, understanding that strength is not only physical but also mental and emotional. The officer was led away quietly, but the impact of his actions and their consequences would not be forgotten. Cameras and phones had captured everything. Witnesses would recount the story repeatedly. The lesson was clear. Arrogance, bias, and misuse of power are always visible, and accountability cannot be avoided when harm is caused. As Keanu and his daughter left the scene, the street seemed lighter, as if the air itself had been cleared. The crowd dispersed with whispers of awe and admiration, each person reflecting on what they had witnessed. They had not only seen an act of injustice, but also a powerful example of calm authority, accountability, and integrity. In that moment, the street became more than just a location of an incident. It became a lesson in courage, respect, and the quiet, undeniable force of presence. The bystanders would remember it for years, and the officer would never forget the impact of underestimating someone based on assumptions. The young girl had suffered harm, but she also experienced protection, justice, and recognition. And in the quiet, controlled actions of her father, the crowd saw a truth that echoed far beyond the moment. Strength is measured not by aggression, but by calm, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what is right. The street had quieted, but the impact of what had just occurred lingered like an electric pulse. Witnesses replayed every moment in their minds: the officer's arrogance, the girl's quiet courage, and the calm, commanding presence of Keanu Reeves. It was more than a confrontation. It had become a lesson in courage, integrity, and the subtle power of presence. The young girl, now supported by her father, looked at the street that had watched her ordeal. Her arm throbbed from the injury, but her eyes shone with resilience. This moment had tested her in ways no one could have anticipated. Yet she had remained composed, steady, and brave. A reminder that strength is not measured by physical might alone, but by character and courage in the face of injustice. Keanu Reeves had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had simply arrived, calm and authoritative, letting his presence convey a message far stronger than any words could. The officer, whose arrogance and prejudice had led to reckless violence, now understood the full weight of his actions. Accountability doesn't come from power or title. It comes from fairness, integrity, and the courage to do what is right. Bystanders whispered among themselves, still captivated by the scene. "Did you see how calm he was?" one murmured. "That's real strength, quiet, controlled, and respected." The lesson was clear. Influence isn't about intimidation, it's about presence. Respect isn't demanded through force. It's earned through integrity and action. Social media would soon explode with the story. Videos of the incident, of the girl's composure, and of Keanu's calm authority were already circulating. Comments poured in. "True courage is standing up even when no one else does." "Keanu Reeves just showed that calm presence beats arrogance every time." "Respect and integrity are stronger than any uniform." People everywhere were inspired, learning that assumptions and prejudice carry consequences, but courage, fairness, and calm resolve can shift the tide of any situation. Keanu's actions highlighted a crucial truth. Leadership and strength are not measured by aggression. They are measured by how one responds to injustice, protects the vulnerable, and upholds fairness. He had turned a potentially traumatic event into a powerful lesson, for his daughter, for the officer, and for everyone witnessing it. The officer, meanwhile, would never forget this encounter. His assumptions, his blind prejudice, and his misuse of authority had been exposed. He had faced accountability not through intimidation or threat, but through calm, undeniable presence. It was a lesson he could never unlearn. As Keanu and his daughter walked away, the street seemed transformed. Witnesses carried with them a new understanding. Strength is quiet but undeniable. Influence is subtle but powerful. Respect is earned, never demanded. They had watched a moment that would linger in memory, a reminder that courage, integrity, and humility are the true measures of character. Type respect in the comments if you believe real strength comes from integrity and humility. Share where you're watching from, home, work, or somewhere unexpected, and join the conversation. In the end, it wasn't the screams, the sirens, or even the injury that defined the night. It was the calm authority, the courage in the face of injustice, and the undeniable lesson that true power is shown through character, not arrogance. Influence doesn't shout, respect doesn't demand, and courage, when paired with integrity, leaves a mark that lasts far longer than any moment of fear.